Thank you, Mandalee, and thank you to CAEP for always hosting these spaces for us to present and share some information that we think is going to be really valuable for the field. So I see a few familiar faces, and I'm excited for you all to be here today. As many of you know, this is the second session of a two-part series on exploring equity in CAEP programming using the adult education pipeline dashboard data. Previously in session 1, we looked at tools and processes to explore equity across CAEP, and today we're really going to narrow in on career education and dive a little bit deeper into the significance of labor market information for your programming. Next slide, please. Great, so here on the slide, you'll see our presenters for today. We have Blair Wilson-Toso, who is our Senior Program Manager over the CAEP program, and our partnership with the Chancellor's Office. My name is Jessica Keach. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Senior Research Associate here at West Ed, working on program evaluation and supporting a lot of the CAEP dashboard work that we do. We're also joined by Ayanna Smith, who's a program coordinator supporting CAEP. And additionally, we're also supported by Alexandria Wright, who's our Senior Research Associate here and really specializes in economic and labor market data. And she will be walking you through some really important data and ways to look at equity in some of that career ed and labor market information. Okay, we're also joined by Myra Diaz, who's the CAEP program lead at the Chancellor's Office, and Lindsay Williams, program manager at the Chancellor's Office. And I will just give it over to Myra for a brief introduction from the CO.
Hi, thank you, Jessica. Just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinar presentation on behalf of the CAEP office and the Chancellor's Office. We're excited that you have chosen to join us this afternoon, and we're looking forward to hear from our great presenters. So thank you for having us.
Thanks, Myra. And I will turn it over to Ayanna, who will walk us through our agenda and objectives for today.
Thank you, Jessica. So first thing today, we're going to go ahead and revisit the learnings from session 1. So if you were able to join us for part 1, thank you for joining us again. And we are going to review what we went over in session 1 for anyone who was not present. Then we're going to talk about equity in career education for adult learners, starting off with a Jamboard activity, then a data review with some data that Jessica Keach put together. And then we're going to discuss some of that data and what we see. And then finally, we're going to have our guest presenter, Alexandria Wright, present to us on labor market information. Our objectives today are to define and operationalize equity in career education, practice using data to inform and ask questions, and to gain a deeper understanding of labor market and economic data and how it can be used in the adult education programming. So now for our session 1 recap. So during part 1 of this equity presentation, we did a walkthrough of the AEP pipeline and related tools. We also did an equity discussion. We completed a data equity walk and then talked about what's next after a data equity walk. So here are some of the Jamboard notes that we recorded from our last session. Why do you work in adult education? We wanted to start there. And some of the answers you all provided, you'll see on the screen. So a lot of wanting to be able to help others. You can relate to the students that you serve in adult education through, you see your family members there, wanting to provide students with resources to support and accomplish their goals, trying to help people achieve a better life for themselves and for their communities. So a lot of people have a personal connection to the work that we're doing, which is really awesome. We also discussed, what does equity in adult education mean to you? And again, some of your responses are on the screen. So making sure that there's access, equity for what services are being provided to support learners. Targeted support was also really important. Making sure they have access to services and information in a variety of languages. So a lot of just that personal touch to making sure that students have access to the resources and information that they need. Okay, and I'll pass it over to Jessica to do a recap of the data equity walk.
Thanks, Ayanna. So in session one, we walked through an abbreviated process of the data equity walk, which is a facilitation technique developed by EdTrust West that encourages you to look at data, reflect on what you see, and record your reflection. So the purpose of the data equity walk was really to answer kind of these first questions all the way on the right in green. What is the problem? What barriers exist and for whom? And a lot of this is also to prompt further questions where you can look deeper into the data and really connect with learners and practitioners in the field to get a deeper understanding of why you're seeing what you're seeing in the data. So we pulled out a few of the learnings that folks identified after going through a data equity walk, looking at some of the data from the adult education pipeline dashboard. One person wrote a decline in enrollment started prior to the pandemic. Someone else indicated that ESL participation was impacted the most. We're looking at the decline in participants by program area between 2018-19 and 2020-21. Someone said, I want to know more. And then another person said, not just in this chart, but in many of the others, Asians seem to have been most affected in the time period. Why? Why is this? The results are really consistent. So I'd like to dig deeper and find out what was going on. So this is an example of how folks looked at data and then said, I want to know more and dive deeper into some of these questions. All right, next slide. Okay, so today we're going to dig a little deeper into career education for adult learners. I do want to acknowledge that at times conversations around equity can be unfamiliar and sometimes uncomfortable, but we had a really incredible first session, and I'm confident that this group is ready to lean into this work and engage in these conversations. And ultimately, just remember that our goal is to learn from one another. And hopefully we'll close out this professional development series, this two-part series, with a better understanding of ways to facilitate conversations around data and equity outside of this space and in your local contexts. Okay, I want to start off by sharing our mindset as we engage in these discussions, particularly as it relates to discussing data or observations from the field. So as we reflect, let's remind ourselves to frame our thoughts and our inquiry around the systems and programs that exist to serve adult learners. It's really important that we remind ourselves not to attribute data to the intrinsic qualities of people or groups. And ultimately, we just want to stay away from making generalizations about the motivations of students or of people. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to start off with a group discussion. We have a question prompt that's going to help us get to know one another and come up with some different ideas of what equity in career education for adult learners means to you. And I'm going to turn it over to Ayana, who is going to help facilitate this activity.
Thank you, Jessica. So if you don't mind, can you please paste the link to the Jamboard in the chat? And then once you all have access to that link, if you can go ahead and click on that and begin answering the prompt. So what does equity in career education for adult learners mean to you? You can go ahead and create a Post-it note here and go ahead and answer that question. We'll give you all a few minutes and then share out. Okay, so we have our first one, access to all. Very important. Efficient and reliable access to programs that lead to living wage jobs. English learners are supported in CTE pathways. Access to education that leads to high wages and promotions. Yes, definitely want to see outcomes. Access or no gatekeeping, minimum qualifications, very important. So yeah, increasing access to anyone who needs the resources. And then we have all students have access to the outcomes they want with the support they need based on their individual circumstances. Career exploration upon program entry. And then we have training programs, short and intensive, offered in the morning and evening, leading directly to a job. Identifying good jobs that do not mirror the local demographic makeup, and then access that for learners. Yeah, so based on the responses you all are putting, I think you're really going to enjoy what's coming next, because this is exactly what we mean when we talk about equity and career education. So it's not just having access to the information, but making sure that it's relevant and making sure that it's achieving outcomes that are sustainable for students. So thank you all so much for participating. Oh, I see we have one more coming in, or two more. Additional student support services are provided to students. So childcare, transportation, connection to community services, etc. Yes, that's very important. And then programming that leverage basic skills, training, and workforce prep. So IET, IELCE, and hastens the goal attainment. Yes. Thank you all for sharing. I'm going to jump back to our presentation. Okay.
Great. So next up, we're going to walk through 4 slides using data from the adult education pipeline. And a lot of the goals that were mentioned right in our Jamboard were things around access and achieving outcomes for all groups, particularly those in greatest need. And the only way we can know if we're doing that is by looking at data for different groups and talking to people from various groups to confirm or dispel what we're seeing in the data. So how do we do that? We disaggregate. And the data that we're going to look at is an example of how high-level information can be disaggregated to uncover interesting differences that ultimately prompt further questions. So as we walk through this data, I'm going to ask you to think about what is surprising to you, what you notice, and what else you might want to know. And at the end, we'll have a really brief discussion where you can share some of those thoughts. So here we're looking at the demographics of CAEP participants in 2020-21 by gender. The blue bar represents all CAEP participants, and the pink bar that's overlaid on top of the blue bar represents CAEP participants in CTE. So as a reminder, participants are students that have attained 12 or more hours of instruction in CAEP programming. Due to some of the reporting challenges in 2020-21 for non-credit community colleges, a coding exception has been applied for non-credit community colleges, and an enrollment record is used as a proxy for that hour threshold for non-credit community college students. The impacts of that coding exception are fairly muted when you look at statewide data, but I do want to point out as we walk through this that this kind of represents a best case scenario of CAEP participant enrollment. So based on this data, it appears that there's a slightly higher proportion of male students in CAEP CTE compared to all CAEP participants statewide. Just going to go ahead and pause for a second and allow you to look at this data and reflect on what stands out to you. All right, next slide, please. Okay, here we're looking at the demographics of CAEP participants in 2020-21 by age. So again, the blue bar represents all CAEP participants and the pink bar represents CAEP participants in CTE. And based on this data, it appears that there's a higher proportion of students ages 60 and older in CTE compared to all CAEP participants statewide. And I'll go ahead and pause again just for a few seconds to allow you to look at this data and reflect on what stands out to you. All right, next slide. Our third slide on demographic makeup of participants is showing CAEP participants in 2020-21 by race and ethnicity. So again, the blue bar represents all CAEP participants. Pink bar is CAEP participants in CTE. And based on this data, it appears that Hispanic students represent the highest proportion of participants in CAEP. However, we are seeing a lower proportion of Hispanic students in CTE compared to overall. So I'll pause one last time, allow you to take a look at this. All right, next slide. So our last slide is showing you the decline in the number of participants in CTE by race and ethnicity between 2018-19, which is a pre-pandemic year, and 2020-21. So, for example, between 2018-19 and 2020-21, the total number of participants in CTE declined by 23% statewide. That's that yellow line. However, the number of CTE participants who identify as Asian, American Indian or Alaska Native, or Black or African American declined by 27%. So those first three bars all the way on the left. Okay, next slide. Now that we've looked at some data, some disaggregated data, I'd love to know if anyone is willing to come off mute and just share something that you noticed. It doesn't have to be really profound, just something simple that stood out to you in one of those 4 slides. And feel free to just unmute yourself and share out with the group.
Good morning. This is Sue from Saddleback College of Education. I wanted to share with you that I noticed when we looked at the gender differences, there were more males that were participating in CTE even more than the CAEP program.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting as well, because overall there's more females, but when you look at the comparison between CTE to CAEP, there's more males in CTE, which I thought was very interesting. Anyone else want to share something that stood out to them?
I'll just kind of second that and say that it's also true in our region that there seems to be it's not proportional to the overall, even though our gender demographic proportions are relatively similar in South Bay. We also see here, we tend to see the proportion in CTE being slightly more male than overall.
Thanks so much. I was a little bit surprised by the higher proportion of older adults in CTE. Did anyone else find that surprising, or is that something that you see as well in your local programs?
I did. I would. We see a lot in the, like on the CAEP fact sheets, we'll see 40 to 50 and then 50 and over as being the vast majority of our students, to the point where I'd love to see those broken out in the same 5-year buckets. I think you use the iPads buckets for age, and the 25 to 44 is such a huge bucket that I think it causes multiple things. I'm kind of like dodging the question, but I think it causes it can cause like your brain to do some things with the proportions, because that 60 and over group probably represents a smaller overall component. So it would maybe be a little bit more sensitive, but it is still surprising, like, I guess maybe nice to see that they're compared to the percentage of CAEP students overall in that age demographic, there's a higher percentage in CTE. I'd be interested to dial in on that group specifically, and like what kind of CTE, you know,
Right.
what are the stories of those students who are skilling up over 60? That's really interesting.
Yeah, and is it, I wonder, and this is just a question for further research, right? Is it some of that workforce reentry or workforce prep? Is it related to any kind of technology? Those I think are further questions, right? What kinds of CTE courses are those older adults more represented in compared to the overall population? And you make a good point about looking deeper into some of those age brackets in that middle category, because that's a lot of students in there. All right, are there any other comments about some of that data before I turn it over to our guest presenter? No? Okay, well, without further ado, I will turn it over to Alexandria Wright, who's going to walk us through some labor market information.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. We can go ahead and keep that deck up, actually. I'm sorry, I thought we could share presentations and I hadn't downloaded a separate one. So thank you so much. So we're going to go into some labor market data today. And we're going to talk about a variety of things. And I'm going to stop and pause. And just like we did that equity gap walk, analysis, we're going to stop and pause and take a look at some things that have to do with labor market data, right? So if we go to the next slide, my apologies, I should have had that separately so I could transition this. So this is a sample of a data deck that we put together using information from US Bureau of Labor Statistics, MZ's database. Some of you might be familiar with Economic Modeling Inc. that is used a lot in educational institutes. And also US Census data, and then also job postings analytics that we go through, talking about skills a little bit, and transferable skills is a very meaningful thing when it comes to adult education. So the first thing that we always look at, this deck happens to be, you can see these little footnotes at the bottom, this happens to be for San Diego County. So all the information that you're going to see in here is very explicit to San Diego County. So the first thing that we want to discuss is the industry sectors. And what are industry sectors actually telling us? It tells us what the demand is for products and services in our region. But even more importantly, for adult educators, it's telling us what types of contextualized skills students need to be valuable in the labor market, right? So adult education has, we have our basic ABE, right? We have our GED HSE programs. If we're lucky and have capacity, we're running IET and IELCE. And so all of those programs can be contextualized to a certain degree. So even our basic skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right, can be contextualized, can incorporate contextualized exercises that reflect the local economy. The one thing that we know is, irrespective of what major a student has, what level of education they have, degree, they end up finding jobs where they live. So their job, so their skill set has to reflect the local economy in order for them to be valued in the local labor market, right? So for example, as we're looking at this, and San Diego County, granted, is very, very large, right? And so there's lots of micro regions within the county, but if we're looking at it countywide, we see, obviously, we have healthcare right there at the top. You also see manufacturing trades, right? Those are two areas, two industry sectors that have a great amount of momentum as we move up the ladder, right? So you can start at these entry-level wages, entry-level occupations. You can attain credentials, industry credentials, through traditional education or other venues as you move up that ladder, and you can move right up into a sense of economic mobility, which is our goal here, right? Equity and economic mobility. And so when we look at this economic landscape and we see healthcare here, we see manufacturing, we see construction there, right? All these numbers that you see are the quantity of employees per sector. So that's why the little squares differ in sizes And so what we can do in reading, writing, and arithmetic is engage the context of these industry sectors in exercises, right? So perhaps something like a manufacturing standard operating procedures, an SOP. Working with a lot of manufacturers in my career and in a lot of adult ed, IET, as well as pre-apprenticeship programs, I recognize that SOPs, reading and interpreting and writing standard operating procedures is something that employers are looking for. And it is the very applied praxis, right, of basic skills. Can you interpret in a standard operating procedure? Perhaps that's an exercise that can go into the classroom, right? Shoot, healthcare and social assistance, we can just start with an application, right? With the forms that you fill out when you walk into a hospital, when you walk into a clinic, they themselves are so nuanced and complex, they would be great exercises for students. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This next slide is about the most posted skills in your region. So this spanned a year's time, okay? So 2021 to 2022. And the little numbers that you see in there is the frequency with which those skills are posted, are seen in job postings, okay? So as you can see here, we have communications, right? You have management and operations, but you have and going directly to the livable wage skills. So sales and customer service, lovely skills, lovely skills. Those are not the livable wage jobs, right, that we are looking for these students. The jobs that have the livable wages are the ones that are requiring Microsoft Office skills, right? Digital literacy, Microsoft Excel, okay? So while we're looking at these skills, we have the industry sectors, we have our occupations that we're going to get to in just a second, and we have these skills. And the combination of looking at all of them allows us as educators to be much more contextualized and further effective in the classroom in making sure that that student, traditional and non-traditional age students, right, obtain the skills that they need to make them more valuable in that labor market. So again here, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you, Ayana. So we put together this little slide because I wanted to make a real strong point here. Adult education, when we think about adult ed IET programs, right, which are a fabulous combination of adult basic skills plus industry credentials and technical training, right, we tend to float around three primary industry sectors. They're the easiest ones, right? Healthcare, manufacturing, and construction, right? So those three sectors are, again, sectors that contain a lot of mobility in them. You can get your entry-level jobs that are unskilled, right? And move right up that ladder as you gain more education. But remember, in each one of these sectors, verbal and written communication, digital literacy and basic math, and time management and organizational skills are essential to being an effective employee and having further opportunity to move up that ladder. Okay, so one of the key equity strategies that we speak about is ensuring that students can articulate the transferable skills that they have learned. Now, I'm not just speaking of mock interviews, okay? I'm speaking of exercises in the classroom that allows them to practice articulating, because one of those, that big social equity gap, or that big gap in social equity or social capital, I'm sorry, is not having the luxury and the privilege of a family that had you speak all the time, or had you, pardon me, I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry, guys, that had you constantly communicate and articulate, right? And so one of the things that we can do is increase the practice in a contextualized way. So you heard me mention healthcare. You heard me mention standard operating procedures for manufacturing, right? So those are a couple of different exercises that you can engage in the classroom and then have the students talk about. I used to work with welding instructors. I've had the welding instructors assign a 350-word essay for their students. Now, you know, students often get very bored, right? They get bored in the classical English and math classes, right? So they're sitting there reading Jane Austen, right? Or Jane Eyre, and it has nothing to do with the world that they live in and the problems that they deal with on an everyday basis, which is something that's unique to adult education, right? You work where the rubber meets the road with these students, right? This isn't some privileged hierarchy of education. You are there with the students that need assistance because they're trying to put food on their table and trying to pay these rents, right? And so again, in order to help them with their economic mobility, they have to be able to articulate the skills that they've learned, okay? One example was in an adult ed program that I worked with, we did a quick 8-hour exercise, 8 hours, 4 of which was basic math, but within the context of manufacturing, okay? So where you were looking at dimensions and tolerances, okay? So something very applied, okay? And then we just spent the other 4 hours in reading comprehension and communication in the context of lean manufacturing. For those of you who aren't familiar, lean manufacturing is that concept that came out of Japan and Tadao that essentially is elimination of waste. So that one 8-hour class, reduced the turnover rate at one of our local large manufacturing plants by over 80%. And a lot of those students that were transferring in were students that we were coordinating with coming from Goodwill Industries into the adult education program and then into placement. So that's why I'm just emphasizing the ability that adult educators have to go ahead and contextualize the reading, writing, and arithmetic basic skills training, that ABE training, to your local industry sector. And then from there, you can start to build up into the IET programs, preferably engaging industry credentials in those IET programs, right? I've worked with construction, with a national industry recognized construction program that some of you may have been aware of. So we use that as a pre-apprenticeship, right? I would design contextual pre-apprenticeship programs for manufacturing that all employers in the local area were aware of, right? And so it was like a nice 40-hour course with that credential that was recognizable by those employers. There's several different options that you can do here. Agriculture is another one. California is huge on ag. We ran at my recent institute that I was with. We ran an agricultural supervisor academy that started out as a corporate learning training for ag supervisors in Spanish, and it ended up being turned into an adult education IELCE program where we were now engaging English language learning with the technical skills. And we had 2 levels of that by the end of it, right? So this is the kind of stuff that you can start to harness. Remember, in the 21st century pedagogy and andragogy is 3 things. Learning must be participatory, it must be productive, and it must be personalized. We are a different creature than we were in previous centuries and millennia. There is much more technology. There is much more desire, and with technology comes the ability for one to imagine themselves and self-actualize themselves. So again, the students demand that learning, again, is participatory, productive, and personalized. All right, we can go to the next slide now. So let's get into some jobs. Okay, so we have 2 slides here that we're going to look at with regard to occupations. So the first one is a table that you probably have seen before, which is largest occupations, right? Everybody always kind of looks at that. What are the largest occupations in my area? You see here that we looked at a 5-year projection so we could best understand what the trajectory of these occupations were going to be in the next 5 years. And we also do median hourly earnings. But look over here on the left-hand side, when we put together the data, we want to ensure that we are comparing hourly earnings to a livable wage. Now, remember, this is median hourly earnings. So if you're working, if you have a nice institute that you can look at, and this is available through, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, the first thing I should have mentioned was your CAEP fact sheet. So a lot of this information came from the Launchboard Adult Education Pipeline, as well as the 2021 CAEP fact sheets. So you'll see median hourly earnings in there. So they are medium, they're not entry level, but it gives you a nice understanding of what's going on with the character of that occupation. So it's always a good thing to keep in mind the living wage. The living wage that we used for the state of California is coming from the California Insight Center, which is what the chancellor's office would prefer to use. There are other living wage calculators out there, such as the MIT living wage calculator. So as we go through it, we also color coded. Thank you very much for that link to the adult ed fact sheets. We color coded, green meaning jobs are growing, orange jobs are projected to decline. Now, if you look at your local area and you see an orange and the decline is only by a handful of jobs, take it with a grain of salt, right? We're looking for big declines, 20, 30 job declines in order for that to be really meaningful. So in adult education, we can start with these largest occupations, right? And these are largest occupations, by the way, that require some college or a certificate, right? So not necessarily even an associate's degree. This is largest occupations that require some college. So that's the other filter that you want, right? Both adult educators and community colleges always had a tendency to simply look at largest occupations, period, without looking at that skill level qualification. Luckily now we have databases where we can actually filter for that. So these occupations that you're looking at are actually the ones that require some sort of credential, right? Like I said, not a formal degree, but definitely some sort of credential, right? So this is where you can start looking at when you start contextualizing your basic skills training, and if you are interested in developing an IET program or an IELCE program, okay? And then so you combine this with the equity gap analysis that Jessica was showing you earlier, right? You have to identify your target populations, right? Those historically marginalized communities, what's going on with them. Then you identify your target pathway, right? What industry sector, what occupations are you looking at? And then furthermore, you identify your strategy, your learning strategy. Is it going to be contextualized ABE? Is it going to be an IET or IELCE program? Is it going to be a non-credit pre-apprenticeship that buddies up to a local community college, right? So that's the fourth thing you got to do. And then finally, or the third thing you got to do. And then the fourth thing that you finally have to do is look at your system partners. Adult educations are part of this wonderful workforce system. I say that, again, take it with a grain of salt. I know we've all had our experiences with the workforce system, but the point is we have federally funded partners to assist with the actual access for a lot of these programs, right? And for the connectivity and the cross-referencing of students, right? Finding those students. I just was lecturing earlier today to a college in Colorado, and a gentleman was very concerned over the lack of GED and high school graduation rates. He was concerned about the dropouts, right? And he said, where can I find those dropouts? Where are they? Because they're not even in our adult schools yet. They literally just dropped out of high school. And I said, well, this is where the system, the pathway system partner, the workforce system partners come into play. You find these people through goodwill partnerships, your local community-based organizations that serve target population, racial and ethnic groups, right? Or gender or age, whatever it is, but you have to buddy up to those pathway partners, those system partners in order to find the people. And then you start coalescing all the services. I know this isn't news to everybody there. You've all sat in your Title II workforce system lectures, I'm sure, and talked to your partners about co-enrollment and leveraging resources. But this is a way that you can do it using your labor market information and your economic data and that socio-demographic data as kind of the core from which you build this larger project. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you so much, Anna. This is actually my favorite slide. It's highest paying occupations requiring some college or a credential. The reason why this is my favorite is because, again, we're not just starting with the entry-level wage jobs. These are truly the pathways that are going to help our students with economic mobility. You see the same color coding here. You see the same 5-year projection and the median hourly earnings. We also put again here your livable wage, which again is sitting in your adult ed, your CAEP fact sheets, 2021 fact sheets. But here's where you really start to get to the meat of how to contribute to your students with regard to economic mobility, right? So we have the contextualization of basic skills looking at our industry sectors, right? And keeping in mind those transferable skills, we can integrate those contextualized transferable skills, not just into basic education, ABE, not just into GED, HSC programs, but we can start to use other strategies like IET, like IELCE, like non-credit pre-apprenticeships, all of the above, right? And then we take that a step further and we start to really zone in on the credentials and the occupational training. So if we look at this list right here, right, there's a lot of stuff here that actually comes already with industry credentials, nationally recognized industry credentials, okay? So if we go down a little bit here, of course you had, okay, so we have mechanical drafters. So I'm just gonna stop right here. It's one of the higher paying jobs requiring one credential. So mechanical drafters are really using AutoCAD now. It's computer aided drafting. You don't need an associate's degree. You don't need a bachelor's degree. You need some understanding of basic math, and you need to understand how to use the software, and it needs to be of interest to you. So that is actually something that you could probably engage in an IET, right? Or at least the prep for a SolidWorks program at your local community college or AutoCAD program, right? So you start by engaging the student in this field of mechanical drafting in an IET program. So you're talking about AutoCAD, you're showing them SolidWorks, you're using your basic math lectures and your exercises, right, as an applied theory for mechanical drafting. And again, mechanical drafting is used all over the place. I've seen it in every form of manufacturing, from custom-made clutches in auto manufacturers to dental implants, to the design of actual products, right? So this job, even though you don't see a terribly amount over here, right, you're still seeing a growth rate. And that's because, again, it's very modern. It's something that you can apply immediately. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next page. Thank you so much. Now we're going to get into some more of that institutional data that Jessica was showing you earlier from the CAEP system. So what did we look at? We looked at industry sectors. We looked at skills and transferable skills. And then we looked at occupations. And then we talked about the kind of 4 steps of identifying the pathway that'll contribute to economic mobility, right? Identifying the strategy, identifying the target population, and then 4th, identifying those workforce system partners. So now we come back to the data, right? And we start to look at who is transitioning. This is again in your CAEP fact sheets, I believe on the 3rd or the 4th tab on those CAEP fact sheets. And you can actually see who's transitioning from basic education, GED and ESL programs into either CTE programs at their local community college, into the community college in general, or just if you wanted to be very, very explicit in your view, who's transitioning to non-developmental courses, right? And that's something that's probably of great interest to all of you. So as you were looking at Jessica's charts, right, that came from AEP, we can start to look at this specifically for your consortium. So this is for the San Diego Adult Education Regional Consortium, right? And this is, again, just came from your CAEP fact sheets. It's just visualized a little differently, okay? And so we're looking at the existing students coming out. What do we notice? I'll just pause here for a second because I've been talking a lot. Does anybody want to speak up about anything you're noticing on this chart? And take a minute or two. Or is there anything else you would want to know? Rick, anything you notice or anything you want to know?
It doesn't seem super equal. from what I'm noticing. Not to be too on its face about it. Just a clarifying question. What else composes the transition to post-secondary besides CTE and credit non-developmental? In other words, what's missing, I guess, from that? Like, how do I get to, for overall, how do I get to 24 from, what are the other categories I might be looking for?
I'm going to hand that to Jessica or Blair.
Yeah, I took it.
Yeah.
So the definitions should be the overall transition to post-secondary is transition to CTE, any institution, right? So adult ed or community college, and then or to transition to non-developmental credit college courses. So theoretically they are the same, right? Like the transition to post-secondary is that higher bucket. There are a few small definitional differences in the way that they are captured. I'll go ahead and put the MDD in the chat. It's really kind of
That'd be great.
Yeah, it's in the weeds. It has to do with some of the TOPS Pro flags, but
Kind of what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
You don't need to spend a ton of time on that. I was just like, one of the things I noticed is like, well, 16 and 4 don't equal 24. So where are those other, what is it, a whole different category, or is it just folks in these categories that maybe we're not capturing with this frame? So
yeah,
yeah, throw me the link. I think I'm already in it, but if it sends me to the right spot in there, I'd be super grateful, because this.
Perfect. Yeah. And so something that I noticed when I was looking at this data, Lexi, is that overall transition to post-secondary is about 24%. But then when you look at Asian students, it's lower, right? It's about 18%. You look at white students, it's much higher, about 34%. So I saw some differences there. It's kind of what stood out to me first.
Thank you. Excellent. And, again, this is inquiry. There's no wrong answer. There's no wrong observation. We can look at our Black and African American populations, and we see there that we have a 17% transfer rate to CTE, right? And a 28% transition rate to post-secondary in general. We see our Latinx, Hispanic, and Latino population at about a 14% transition over to CTE, right? And 24% transition into post-secondary in general. But we want to make sure we are not over-representing a category either, right? We want to make sure that not everybody's getting funneled into CTE programs just because they are of a certain race or gender or ethnicity. What I found that was interesting is our data on transfer to non-developmental courses. We are seeing that the white population exceeds all others, right? And so that's something interesting that has everything to do with our adult education, right? So why do we not have such a high transition rate to non-developmental courses for our other racial and ethnic categories? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. And this is one of the ones I really dig on because I'm a demand analyst. I'm a demand economist. So I'm always looking for, where are our students coming from? What is happening? What's going on out there? Where do we find them? And so this is a really nice one. This is looking at the micro region for the area. And I use this a lot with community colleges to encourage them to communicate and to create more leveraged resources and access coming from the schools that are listed here. Because again, a major element, strategy for obtaining greater equity is ensuring that our connectivity between adult schools and community colleges is much more refined, much more accessible, a smooth path, so to speak, a yellow brick road, so to speak, right? It's not even necessarily which road do you take at a crossroads. It's the path is laid out and you have multiple option in here. Just follow the yellow brick road. So this one is looking at who's graduating the most in the microregion, right? So you can see kind of the rates there per school district. One of the ones that I found is interesting, sometimes if you sniff around in here, you'll see adult education programs at the local correctional facilities. You know, that's something that community colleges might not be engaged with by any means. So again, this is an interesting thing to know what your partners are doing, what you're doing, who's actually preparing the most and transitioning the most to post-secondary. This can give you a really nice example of that. Okay, so I think that's the last slide we have in here for this. If you want to just go ahead and go to the next one, Ayana, just to make sure. Oh, I had one more in here. And this is a nice little preview. So I'm giving you guys a little preview to the June sessions that will be coming up. I believe they're June 5th, June 14th and 28th. Maybe we can repeat that at the end. But this is your career education to workforce regional map, right? So this is what we're going to be talking about in June. Myself and the other data analyst, Ali Bilella, she created a great dashboard here. What we did is we took the information from that dashboard and we created this nice little table, because this is one last tool that you can use to help identify the pathways that you want to focus on. Because clearly adult schools don't have a ton of resources. You can't help these students major in everything, but you can choose. You can choose a handful of different pathways that are really going to contribute, again, to their economic mobility in the region within which they live. You see here we have the sectors on the left. We have all the adult education offerings that we know of that we were able to filter out of for secondary research, right? This is just coming from online catalogs, etc. Then we have our non-credit offerings, right? That could be a community college or adult school / community college. And then we have our credit offerings over at community colleges. Some of you, in fact, may have received an inquiry a couple months ago asking for you to verify what your current offerings were. And the reason why we were asking you that is for this dashboard. So again, in addition to looking at largest sectors, most frequently posted skills, those largest and highest paying occupations that require a credential, some college or a credential, right? Then taking those 4 data points, putting them in to a little table like this, looking at it. Again, we've already done the work for you, my West Ed colleagues, and we have this regional education to workforce dashboard that we're going to be talking about. We're going to have to hold 2 sessions in the month of June for you guys to walk through this. And we can talk a little bit more about LMI. We can talk a little bit more about equity gap analysis and pull in a couple more data points, intersectional data points there. And we can talk a little bit more contextualized about IET and IELC CE programs if you are interested in. So that does conclude my section of this presentation for today. I'm just going to recap again, right? We had 4 primary steps in what we're doing to create our pathways. We have to identify our target population that we're looking at. Jessica showed you a lot of nice statistics from the AEP profile. In the June sessions, I might pull up some community data for you and show you population against unemployment and poverty rates, which is also a nice visual to see and a nice in-depth analysis when you're really looking at target populations. So you're going to identify that target population. You're going to identify your target pathways based on your industry sectors and your transferable skills, right? You're going to contextualize that learning to that adult basic skills learning to that and IET learning to that. Then you're going to choose your strategies, right? And I already skipped ahead. Are you using contextualized ABE? Are you going to implement IET or IELC? Are you going to go for a non-credit offering? Are you going to make an IET pre-apprenticeship, right? You got to figure out that strategy. Are you going to use industry credentials, or are you just going to contextualize your education, right? Or your learning that you have. And then finally, we have our workforce system partners, and we can't forget about our workforce and also pathway system partners, right? Not just our Title 1B, not just our workforce boards and our one-stops, our departments of rehabilitation, but also those CBOs, right? That's where we get these students, those community-based organizations, Goodwill Industries, etc. So we have 4 primary steps when we're designing pathways, and I just gave you a bunch of data and information to fill your heads with. I hope it wasn't too much, and I hope I didn't speak too fast. So I'll end it there. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in chat. And again, I will be seeing you in June for those other 2 sessions on our regional education to workforce dashboard that specializes in adult education pathway planning.
Thanks, Lexi. Is there any final thoughts or any questions that anyone has before we let you go?
I have a question. I'd be curious from the audience, as far as having listened to Jessica and Alexandria talk about the information that they've presented, how many of you are working or using data to think about pathways to either further training or living wage jobs? And I want to say that when it particularly resonates with me when Alexandria is talking about building those transferable skills, because while we can talk about living wage jobs, we also have the reality of adult learners coming in not quite prepared for some of the requirements for living wage jobs. And so part of our work is to ensure that they are building towards a living wage job on a career pathway, working towards additional training. And so articulating, naming, and supporting people in understanding what those transferable skills are is very important. As is that when she's talking about building those 4 steps, those are really crucial for serving learners who might be in the beginning levels of literacy or English language development. And I'm curious how people have thought about that, if they've used data, or do they have any targeted equity strategies for their adult learners currently planned in your 3-year planning, or work that you're already carrying out? All right, well, people, I think that that's probably not, the silence probably doesn't represent what's actually going on. And if it does, please join us later in June as we really talk a little bit more in depth about building out these career pathways that are appropriate for your local context.
Where Corley, I think Corley came off mute. Did you want to share?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Blair, you asked a lot of great questions. And I don't know if we have all of the time, but I can, for just 1 minute, I can at least say that this was fantastic. Thank you for this presentation. Very well done, because I feel as though the start of our grant, it's just visualizing the pathway, not just for students, but for us as the administrators, and how we articulate this data is so key. How it's so key. And I appreciate the identifying the target populations, the pathways. And so for us, we have relied heavily upon the Centers of Excellence as well as the fact sheet. And what we found is a lot of really great unintended consequences that the pandemic had, like, say, for example, some classes that were that are now online. Some of our ESL classes, some have increased enrollment because they don't have to worry about resources, the bus, caretaking, things like that, of that nature, how that data is going to be impacting. So we're talking about equity. It's really cool how some things have surfaced that we would have never expected, whereas now new legislation on the platform, like SB 554, as well as the state, I think, leaning towards the new legislation coming up with respect to healthcare. So now we're having a lot of supports, and also for us, we're finding out that doing the mapping for our guided pathways into an infrastructure is really helping us, because then that plays a critical role in the advisory role for our advisors to help with those pipelines. So the timing is really cool with this. And so the data, we have used BW Research also to help us dig in further, take a deeper dive into workforce data that helps us to identify what's really lacking. As you know, coming from Santa Barbara Consortium, there's this myth that everyone's wealthy here. And it is true, we cater, a large section of our population caters to the wealthy, but that means that a majority of the workforce is doing that. And what does that workforce look like? So dissecting this is really key, because we could see the anatomy. I am blown away. I'm still on the first slide, to tell you the truth. Santa Barbara, our population is very, very much more mature, 60 and older, very, very young. So how that molds into this data, it speaks to us, 60 and over. Construction, I mean, we have so many of our, so many people expressing, okay, I'll say white males in this industry at present, expressing the need for young bilingual learners and students and apprentices. So they're asking for it, but then it's connecting the dots with the living wage. So I thank you for this. So
Excellent. So glad you know, Carly. I've done a lot of work up in northern Santa Barbara, so I'm very familiar with those communities of Lompoc and Guadalupe that you're talking about. And not everybody is city of Santa Barbara reflective, right? With a lot of privilege and luxury out there. Be happy to work with you a little more if you would like a contextualized kind of set of data for that area.
yeah,
I've done a lot of work up at Allen Hancock College, and I think you might be over there.
a little further south.
A little further south. Okay,
yes,
gotcha.
A little further south, representing right south of we're South County, Santa Barbara. So then it also includes Carpinteria. So all the way, and then it hits the borderline with Ventura. So there's a very different market there. Not as much ag, but more tech. More tech, but also we have another increased a hidden labor market in Carpinteria with growing more medicinal refineries, put it that way.
That was a good way to put that. I'm just in Ojai, Corley, and I put my email in the chat box for you. Why don't you go ahead? Please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to compile a little data deck.
Okay, so you know, okay, great. Sorry, you need to explain.
Okay, that's excellent. I love that though. What did you say? Medicinals, bulk medicinals.
Oh yeah,
harvesting
medicinal refineries.
Refineries. There you go. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you all so much. It has been really great hearing your feedback, and Alexandria, it was just really great data and showing, just to follow up with what Corley said, the relationship between skills that are needed, but also those that lead to a living wage job really is so critical. I think we have a last slide on upcoming webinars. Yeah, Ayana, do you want to go ahead and share and then close us out?
Sure. So like Alexandria mentioned, we do have that final upcoming two-part session in June on the 14th and the 28th. So you are more than welcome to join us for that if you want to get some more information. And then we also have one more individual webinar opportunity that will also be in June. And I believe Mandalee has posted the links to where you can register again for those. And just thank you again. I'm going to pass it on to Mandalee for some closing statements.
Thank you, West Ed team. As always, it was a very rich conversation as well as information. So thank you so much for taking your time and presenting all that you have found. So thank you again, West Ed team, and to Myra and Lindsay from the Chancellor's Office for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation and sharing with us. And if you will please take time to find in the chat the evaluation link that I had posted. Those evaluations help us to determine what deep dives we will do, what PD we can bring to you. So if you can find a few moments in your day, we'd greatly appreciate it. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close out. Thank you all for attending.